My son screamed, "You'll die alone," when I refused to give him my inheritance early. He had no idea I was already planning something that would change everything. The look on his face when the judge read my final decision left the entire courtroom stunned. Follow my story until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this reaches. At 70, I thought I understood what family meant. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and I spent 47 years as a pediatric nurse in the children's wing of Riverside General Hospital in Charleston, South Carolina. The brick colonial house on Magnolia Street had been my sanctuary for 32 years, purchased with the life insurance money after my husband Robert passed from cancer when our son was only 8 years old. I raised Trevor as a single mother, working double shifts to pay for his private school education, his college tuition at Clemson University, and later his graduate degree in business administration. I attended every soccer game, every school play, every graduation ceremony with pride swelling in my chest. Trevor was my world, my greatest accomplishment, the reason I pushed through exhaustion and loneliness for decades. By the time I retired at 67, I had built something I was proud of. My modest but comfortable home was paid off completely. I had $340,000 in my retirement accounts, carefully saved through years of living frugally and investing wisely. There was another $180,000 in certificates of deposit that Robert's life insurance had grown into over the years. I owned my late husband's vintage 1967 Mustang, which had become a collector's item worth nearly $45,000. Most importantly, I had my health, my independence, and what I thought was a loving relationship with my son. Trevor had seemed to flourish after college. He married his college sweetheart, Melissa, and they moved to nearby Somerville, where he started his own digital marketing agency, Palmetto Digital Solutions. For the first few years, business seemed good. They bought a large house in a gated community, drove expensive cars, and took lavish vacations that they documented extensively on social media. I was proud of his success, even if I sometimes worried about their spending habits. When they had their first child, my granddaughter Sophia, I was overjoyed to become a grandmother. I babysat regularly, helped with costs when needed, and thought we had built the kind of multi-generational family bond that would last forever. But something started changing about 18 months ago. Trevor's visits became less frequent, and when he did come by, he seemed distracted and stressed. He'd make comments about overhead costs and cash flow issues that I didn't fully understand. Melissa stopped bringing Sophia over for our regular Sunday dinners, and when I asked about it, Trevor would brush off my concerns. "Business is just seasonal, Mom," he'd say. "Nothing to worry about. We're just focusing on growth strategies right now." The first real sign of trouble came last Christmas. I had invited Trevor, Melissa, and Sophia over for our traditional Christmas Eve dinner, just like we'd done for the past 6 years. But when they arrived, something was different. Trevor looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his jaw that reminded me uncomfortably of how he'd looked during his difficult teenage years. Melissa seemed on edge, too, constantly checking her phone and making worried glances at Trevor when she thought I wasn't looking. Little Sophia, now 4 years old, was unusually quiet and clingy. The festive atmosphere I'd worked so hard to create felt strained and artificial. After dinner, while Melissa was helping Sophia with a puzzle in the living room, Trevor pulled me aside in the kitchen. His hands were shaking slightly as he helped me load the dishwasher, something I'd never seen before in my confident, successful son. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something," he said, his voice lower than usual. "The business is going through a rough patch. It's temporary, but I might need to ask for your help soon." I felt a flutter of concern in my chest. "What kind of help, sweetheart? Are you talking about money?" He nodded, not meeting my eyes. "Maybe. I don't know yet. I'm hoping to work things out with the bank first, but if I can't..." He trailed off, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was worried about something. "Trevor, how bad is it?" I asked gently, placing my hand on his arm. "You know you can talk to me about anything." "It's not catastrophic," he said quickly. "Just a cash flow problem. Some clients defaulted on big contracts, and I made some investments that didn't pan out. I'm working with a financial advisor to restructure everything." I wanted to ask more questions, but Melissa appeared in the doorway with Sophia in her arms.
We should probably head home, she said, though it was barely 8 p.m. Long day tomorrow. As they gathered their coats and presents, I hugged Trevor tightly. You know I love you, right? And if you really need help, we'll figure something out. He hugged me back, and for a moment he felt like my little boy again. I love you too, Mom. Don't worry about this, okay? I'll handle it. But as I watched their car pull out of my driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to this story than Trevor was telling me. In January, Trevor started calling more frequently. At first, his calls seemed normal, checking on my health, asking about my volunteer work at the hospital's children's charity. But gradually, the conversations began steering toward my finances.
Trevor, I've told you repeatedly that I'm not interested in selling my house or moving to a retirement home. I don't understand why you won't accept that. His jaw tightened, and I saw a flash of anger in his eyes that reminded me of his worst teenage tantrums. Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this. You're 70 years old. This house is too big for you, too expensive to maintain, and frankly, it's not safe for someone your age to be living alone. I've been living safely in this house for over 30 years. I'm in perfect health, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Are you? His voice rose sharply. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're making increasingly poor decisions. You're being stubborn and irrational about obvious solutions to obvious problems. I felt my own anger rising. The only problem I see is my son trying to manipulate me into giving him access to my money by spreading lies about my mental health. That's when the mask finally came off completely. Trevor's face contorted with rage, and he stood it so abruptly that several papers scattered to the floor. Sophia started crying at the sudden loud voices, and Melissa tried to shush her while looking mortified. You want to know the truth? Trevor shouted, his voice echoing off my living room walls. I'm going to lose everything. My business is failing, my credit is destroyed, and I owe people money that I can't pay back. You're sitting here on hundreds of thousands of dollars that you don't even need, and you won't lift a finger to help your own son? Trevor, lower your voice. You're scaring Sophia. Don't tell me how to talk to my mother. He was pacing now, his hands clenched into fists. Do you know what people are going to say when I have to file for bankruptcy? When we lose the house and Sophia has to change schools? They're going to say, didn't his mother have money? Why didn't she help him? People are going to say that you made poor business decisions and face the consequences, just like every other adult in the world. He whirled around to face me, his eyes wild with desperation and fury. You are my son. I am your only child. You owe me this. I don't owe you anything, Trevor. I raised you, educated you, and supported you for 30 years, but I don't owe you my house or my life savings because you can't manage your own finances. The words hung in the air between us like a physical barrier. I could see Melissa holding Sophia tighter, probably wishing she was anywhere else in the world. But Trevor wasn't done. He turned back to me with venom in his eyes. You know what the worst part is? You think you're being noble or independent or something, but you're just a bitter old woman who can't stand to see anyone else succeed. Dad would be ashamed of what you've become. Bringing Robert into this, using my beloved husband's memory as a weapon, was the final betrayal. I felt something break inside my chest, some fundamental belief about who my son was and what our relationship meant. Get out, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the tears I could feel threatening. Get out of my house. Gladly, he spat. But remember this moment, Mom. When you're sitting here alone with your precious money, remember that you chose it over your own family. As they gathered their things and headed for the door, Sophia looked back at me with wide, confused eyes. I tried to smile at her, not wanting my granddaughter to remember this moment as the last time she saw me. After the door slammed behind them, I sat in my living room surrounded by the scattered papers of Trevor's plan for my life, and finally let myself cry. Not just for the relationship I'd lost, but for the realization that it had never been what I thought it was in the first place. My son had never seen me as his mother. He had seen me as his inheritance. And now that I wasn't cooperating with his timeline for accessing that inheritance, he had become my enemy. But as I sat there in the silence of my house, the house he wanted me to sell, I realized something that would change everything. Trevor had made one critical mistake in his campaign to take my money. He had underestimated his mother. The days following that horrific confrontation were some of the darkest I had experienced since Robert's death. I found myself questioning everything, not just about Trevor, but about my own judgment as a mother. Had I somehow failed him? Had I been too generous over the years, creating a sense of entitlement? Or had I been too strict, making him feel like love was conditional on his success? I barely slept for 3 nights, replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I'd missed. The expensive wedding I'd helped pay for when his business was just starting, the down payment assistance I'd given them for their house, the countless times I'd babysat Sophia so they could take weekend trips or attend business functions. Had all of my generosity simply taught him to see me as a source of funding rather than as his mother? But then I remembered something that stopped my spiral of self-doubt cold. 2 years ago, when Melissa's mother had been diagnosed with breast cancer, I'd watched Trevor rally around his wife's family with genuine compassion. He'd driven to Columbia every weekend to help with yard work and household repairs. He'd organized a meal train for his mother-in-law during her chemotherapy treatments. He'd shown the kind of selfless family devotion that had made me proud to be his mother. That man, the one who had dropped everything to help his wife's mother through cancer, was the same person who had just screamed at me for not liquidating my life savings to bail out his business. What had changed? When had I become someone he could threaten and manipulate instead of someone he wanted to protect? The realization hit me like a physical blow. Trevor wasn't inherently cruel or heartless. He was desperate, and desperate people often did things that were completely contrary to their normal character. The question was whether his desperation was purely financial, or if there was something else driving his increasingly erratic behavior. Against every maternal instinct I had, I decided I needed to understand exactly what Trevor was facing. If I was going to make any decisions about helping him or protecting myself from him, I needed facts, not just his emotional outbursts and vague claims about business troubles. I started by doing something I'd never imagined I'd need to do. I researched my own son online. Palmetto Digital Solutions had a website that looked professional enough, but when I dug deeper, I found troubling signs. Several client reviews mentioned incomplete projects and communication issues. There were complaints on the Better Business Bureau website about missed deadlines and unresponsive customer service. More disturbing were the legal filings I discovered through the Charleston County Public Records database. 3 different clients had filed small claims suits against Trevor's company in the past 8 months. 2 judgments had already been rendered against him, totaling nearly $40,000 in damages and legal fees. But the most alarming discovery came when I searched for his personal financial records. Using my knowledge of public databases from my volunteer work with the hospital's charity foundation, I found that Trevor and Melissa's house was in pre-foreclosure proceedings. They were 4 months behind on their mortgage payments, and the bank had filed preliminary paperwork to begin the foreclosure process. Their financial situation wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. They were looking at losing their home within the next 60 days unless they could come up with over $30,000 in back payments and fees. No wonder Trevor had seemed so desperate. No wonder he'd been willing to say such cruel things to his own mother. Armed with this new information, I began to see Trevor's behavior over the past year in a completely different light. The expensive cars I'd noticed them driving weren't signs of success. They were likely leases that they could no longer afford. The lavish vacations they'd posted on social media weren't celebrations of prosperity. They were probably the last gasps of a lifestyle they were desperately trying to maintain as everything fell apart around them. Even more troubling was the realization that Trevor had been lying to me for months, not just about the extent of his financial problems, but about almost everything related to his business and personal life.
When I'd asked about Melissa and Sophia, his vague answers weren't just distraction. They were covering up the fact that his family was facing the loss of their home and the destruction of their credit. I felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at being lied to and manipulated, sadness for what Trevor and his family were going through, and a growing fear about what someone in his position might do if he felt truly cornered. But there was something else nagging at me, a detail that didn't fit the pattern of simple financial desperation. If Trevor needed $200,000 to save his business and his house, why had he been pushing me to sell my home and move to assisted living? The house sale would generate far more money than he needed for his immediate crisis. Where did he plan for the excess money to go? That question led me to make some phone calls that revealed an even more disturbing picture. I contacted the retirement community Trevor had been pushing so hard, the one in Mount Pleasant that he'd described as perfect for my needs. When I spoke to their admissions coordinator and described the conversations I'd had with my son, her response chilled me to the bone. "Mrs. Whitfield, I remember speaking with your son several times over the past few months. He was very specific about wanting to understand our fee structure and payment options, but he never mentioned that you were interested in moving here. In fact, he seemed primarily concerned with understanding how the financial arrangements worked for families who were managing their parents' care decisions." Managing their parents' care decisions. The phrase made my stomach turn. Trevor hadn't been researching the retirement community for my benefit. He'd been researching it to understand how to control my finances once I was living there.
I barely slept for 3 nights, replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I'd missed. The expensive wedding I'd helped pay for when his business was just starting, the down payment assistance I'd given them for their house, the countless times I'd babysat Sophia so they could take weekend trips or attend business functions. Had all of my generosity simply taught him to see me as a source of funding rather than as his mother? But then I remembered something that stopped my spiral of self-doubt cold. 2 years ago, when Melissa's mother had been diagnosed with breast cancer, I'd watched Trevor rally around his wife's family with genuine compassion. He'd driven to Columbia every weekend to help with yard work and household repairs. He'd organized a meal train for his mother-in-law during her chemotherapy treatments. He'd shown the kind of selfless family devotion that had made me proud to be his mother. That man, the one who had dropped everything to help his wife's mother through cancer, was the same person who had just screamed at me for not liquidating my life savings to bail out his business. What had changed? When had I become someone he could threaten and manipulate instead of someone he wanted to protect? The realization hit me like a physical blow. Trevor wasn't inherently cruel or heartless. He was desperate, and desperate people often did things that were completely contrary to their normal character. The question was whether his desperation was purely financial, or if there was something else driving his increasingly erratic behavior. Against every maternal instinct I had, I decided I needed to understand exactly what Trevor was facing. If I was going to make any decisions about helping him or protecting myself from him, I needed facts, not just his emotional outbursts and vague claims about business troubles. I started by doing something I'd never imagined I'd need to do. I researched my own son online. Palmetto Digital Solutions had a website that looked professional enough, but when I dug deeper, I found troubling signs. Several client reviews mentioned incomplete projects and communication issues. There were complaints on the Better Business Bureau website about missed deadlines and unresponsive customer service. More disturbing were the legal filings I discovered through the Charleston County Public Records database. 3 different clients had filed small claims suits against Trevor's company in the past 8 months. 2 judgments had already been rendered against him, totaling nearly $40,000 in damages and legal fees. But the most alarming discovery came when I searched for his personal financial records. Using my knowledge of public databases from my volunteer work with the hospital's charity foundation, I found that Trevor and Melissa's house was in pre-foreclosure proceedings.
They were 4 months behind on their mortgage payments, and the bank had filed preliminary paperwork to begin the foreclosure process. Their financial situation wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. They were looking at losing their home within the next 60 days unless they could come up with over $30,000 in back payments and fees. No wonder Trevor had seemed so desperate. No wonder he'd been willing to say such cruel things to his own mother. Armed with this new information, I began to see Trevor's behavior over the past year in a completely different light. The expensive cars I'd noticed them driving weren't signs of success. They were likely leases that they could no longer afford. The lavish vacations they'd posted on social media weren't celebrations of prosperity. They were probably the last gasps of a lifestyle they were desperately trying to maintain as everything fell apart around them. Even more troubling was the realization that Trevor had been lying to me for months, not just about the extent of his financial problems, but about almost everything related to his business and personal life. When I'd asked about Melissa and Sophia, his vague answers weren't just distraction. They were covering up the fact that his family was facing the loss of their home and the destruction of their credit. I felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at being lied to and manipulated, sadness for what Trevor and his family were going through, and a growing fear about what someone in his position might do if he felt truly cornered. But there was something else nagging at me, a detail that didn't fit the pattern of simple financial desperation. If Trevor needed $200,000 to save his business and his house, why had he been pushing me to sell my home and move to assisted living? The house sale would generate far more money than he needed for his immediate crisis. Where did he plan for the excess money to go? That question led me to make some phone calls that revealed an even more disturbing picture. I contacted the retirement community Trevor had been pushing so hard, the one in Mount Pleasant that he'd described as perfect for my needs. When I spoke to their admissions coordinator and described the conversations I'd had with my son, her response chilled me to the bone. "Mrs. Whitfield, I remember speaking with your son several times over the past few months. He was very specific about wanting to understand our fee structure and payment options, but he never mentioned that you were interested in moving here. In fact, he seemed primarily concerned with understanding how the financial arrangements worked for families who were managing their parents' care decisions." Managing their parents' care decisions. The phrase made my stomach turn. Trevor hadn't been researching the retirement community for my benefit. He'd been researching it to understand how to control my finances once I was living there.
Patricia helped me understand that I had several options for protecting myself, ranging from restraining orders to criminal complaints to preventative legal measures that would make it impossible for Trevor to gain control over my finances, even if something did happen to my health in the future. But as we discussed various approaches, I realized that I wanted to do something more than just defend myself. I wanted Trevor to understand the full consequences of his actions, not just for me, but for his wife and daughter who had been caught up in his desperate schemes. Most importantly, I wanted him to understand that threatening to abandon his mother, telling me I would die alone, was about to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But not in the way he'd intended. Trevor had gambled everything on breaking me down, manipulating me into giving him access to my life savings. He'd been willing to destroy our relationship, damage my reputation, and steal my independence for money. He was about to learn that some gambles have consequences that last far longer than the crisis that prompted them. And I was about to show him exactly how much his mother had learned about protecting herself during 47 years of taking care of other people's families. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson was going to change everything. For 3 weeks after Trevor's explosive confrontation in my living room, my phone didn't ring once with a call from him. The silence was deafening and deliberate, a punishment designed to make me reconsider my position. He was betting that the absence of contact with my only child and granddaughter would break me down emotionally and make me more willing to negotiate on his terms. What Trevor didn't know was that this silence was actually a gift. It gave me the time and emotional space I needed to fully understand what I was dealing with and plan my response accordingly. During those quiet weeks, I threw myself into research and preparation with the same methodical approach I'd used during my nursing career when dealing with complex patient cases. I spent hours each day documenting everything that had happened, creating a timeline of Trevor's escalating demands and increasingly manipulative behavior. I printed out copies of all the public records I'd found about his business troubles, his legal judgments, and the foreclosure proceedings against his house. I saved screenshots of his social media posts that contradicted the story he'd been telling me about his financial situation. Most importantly, I began reaching out to the people in our community that Trevor had been feeding lies to about my supposed mental decline. I wanted to understand exactly what he'd been saying and to whom, so I could counter his narrative with facts. Damage assessment. My first stop was Mrs. Patterson, my next-door neighbor, who had mentioned Trevor's claims about my memory problems. I invited her over for coffee and asked her directly what my son had told her. "Oh, Eleanor, I hope you don't mind that I'm bringing this up, but Trevor seemed so worried about you when I ran into him at the hardware store last month. He said you'd been getting confused about dates and appointments, and that you'd gotten lost driving to places you'd been going to for years." My jaw clenched. Trevor had been specific and detailed in his lies, making them sound credible by including concrete examples that would concern any caring neighbor. "Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that none of that is true. I've never gotten lost driving anywhere, and I've never missed appointments due to confusion. Trevor has been spreading these lies because he wants me to sell my house and give him the money for his failing business." Her eyes widened in shock. "Eleanor, surely you don't think Trevor would lie about something so serious?" "I have documentation of his business failures, his debt problems, and the foreclosure proceedings against his house. And I have medical records from my recent cognitive assessment showing that my mental function is completely normal for my age. Trevor has been manipulating people's concern for my well-being to pressure me into giving him access to my life savings." The conversation was difficult, but Mrs. Patterson was a reasonable woman who had known me for 15 years. By the time she left, she was convinced that Trevor had been misleading her, and she was angry about being used in his manipulation campaign. Similar conversations with other neighbors, acquaintances, and family friends revealed the full scope of Trevor's lies. He hadn't just mentioned my supposed memory problems in passing, he had been actively campaigning to convince people that I was declining mentally and needed intervention from my family. The medical conspiracy. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when I visited my longtime family physician, Dr. Marcus Reeves, who had been treating me for over 20 years. During what I thought would be a routine follow-up appointment, Dr. Reeves mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Eleanor, I was glad to get your son's call last month. It's always good to see adult children taking an active interest in their parents' health care as they age." "What call?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. Dr. Reeves looked surprised by my question. "Trevor called to discuss his concerns about some cognitive changes he had been observing in you. He asked about early signs of dementia and what resources might be available for families dealing with those challenges."
I felt the familiar surge of anger and betrayal that had become so common in recent weeks. Trevor had gone behind my back to my own doctor, planting seeds of doubt about my mental capacity with the one person whose opinion could carry real weight in any legal proceedings about my competence. "Dr. Reeves, Trevor has been lying to people about my mental state because he wants me to liquidate my assets to bail out his failing business. I haven't experienced any cognitive changes, and I'd like you to note in my record that any concerns raised by my son are unfounded and motivated by his financial desperation." To his credit, Dr. Reeves took my concerns seriously and agreed to add a detailed note to my medical file documenting that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment and that I was reporting manipulative behavior from a family member. He also recommended that I consider getting an independent psychological evaluation to create additional documentation of my mental competence. But the damage was already done. Trevor's call to my doctor was now part of my medical record, and it could potentially be used as evidence that family members had been concerned about my mental state. Even though Dr. Reeves believed me and supported my position, the mere existence of that phone call could be twisted to support claims about my competence. The financial surveillance. During the 4th week of Trevor's silent treatment, I discovered that his withdrawal from communication didn't mean he'd given up on his plans. He'd simply shifted to more covert tactics. The revelation came during a routine visit to my bank to review my monthly statements. "Mrs. Whitfield," said Jennifer Chen, the branch manager I'd worked with for years, "I wanted to let you know that we've had several inquiries about your accounts recently. Since you didn't initiate them, I thought you should be aware." My heart sunk as she explained that someone had been calling the bank claiming to be my son and asking about my account balances, recent transactions, and the procedures for family members to gain access to accounts in case of medical emergencies. "We didn't provide any information, of course," Jennifer assured me, "but the caller seemed very familiar with your banking history and account details. He knew your social security number, your mother's maiden name, and other personal information that would normally be used for identity verification." I realized that Trevor had been planning his financial takeover much longer than I'd initially understood. He'd been gathering the personal information he would need to potentially access my accounts or convince bank personnel that he had legitimate authority to act on my behalf. I want to add additional security measures to all of my accounts immediately, and I want to be notified of any future inquiries about my finances, regardless of who claims to be making them. We spent the next hour implementing new security protocols that would make it virtually impossible for anyone, including Trevor, to gain unauthorized access to my financial information. But the incident made me realize that Trevor's campaign against me was more sophisticated and more dangerous than I had initially understood. The social isolation campaign. Trevor's next move was to expand his isolation campaign beyond just withholding contact himself. He began systematically poisoning my relationships with other family members and friends by spreading increasingly alarming stories about my supposed mental decline. My sister Carol called me in tears one evening, explaining that Trevor had contacted her again with what he described as urgent concerns about my safety and well-being. "Eleanor, he says you called him confused and disoriented last week, not remembering conversations you'd had the day before," Carol said, her voice shaking with worry. "He's convinced you're having serious memory problems and that you're not safe living alone anymore." The lies were becoming more elaborate and more specific. Trevor wasn't just claiming I was forgetful, he was inventing detailed scenarios of confusion and disorientation that would justify immediate intervention. "Carol, I haven't spoken to Trevor in nearly a month. He's been giving me the silent treatment because I won't give him money for his business. Every story he's telling you is a complete fabrication." But I could hear the doubt in my sister's voice. Trevor's lies were detailed and delivered with such apparent concern that they were convincing even to people who knew me well. He was systematically destroying my credibility and social support network, making it seem like everyone should be worried about my capacity to live independently. The legal groundwork. The most chilling revelation came when I received a call from a social worker with Charleston County Adult Protective Services. The woman, who introduced herself as Linda Martinez, explained that they had received a report of possible elder self-neglect and wanted to schedule a home visit to assess my situation. "A family member expressed concerns about your ability to care for yourself safely. They reported that you've been having memory problems, difficulty managing your medications, and some confusion about financial matters that could put you at risk."
I felt physically sick as I realized what Trevor had done. He had filed a report with Adult Protective Services, using the authority of a government agency to legitimize his claims about my incompetence.
If APS found any basis for concern about my ability to care for myself, it could trigger a cascade of legal proceedings that might result in guardianship or conservatorship, exactly what Trevor had been planning all along. I would be happy to meet with you, I told Miss Martinez, but I want you to know that I believe this report was filed by my son as part of an attempt to gain control over my finances. I have medical documentation of my mental competence, and I can provide evidence of his financial motives for making these false claims. Miss Martinez was professional and seemed genuinely interested in getting to the truth rather than simply processing a routine complaint. We scheduled a home visit for the following week, and she advised me to gather any documentation that might be relevant to addressing the concerns that had been raised. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen feeling overwhelmed by the scope of Trevor's campaign against me. He wasn't just pressuring me directly or lying to friends and neighbors. He was systematically building an official record of concern about my competence that could be used in legal proceedings to strip me of my rights and autonomy. The professional response. That evening, I called my lawyer, Patricia Henley, and explained what had happened with Adult Protective Services. Her response was immediate and decisive. Mrs. Whitfield, your son has just escalated this situation from elder abuse to attempted guardianship fraud. Filing false reports with APS in an attempt to have someone declared incompetent is a serious criminal offense, and it gives us grounds for immediate legal action to protect you. Patricia explained that we needed to act quickly to counter Trevor's narrative before it gained any more official legitimacy. She recommended that I undergo comprehensive psychological and cognitive testing from an independent specialist, and that we'd begin documenting everything for potential criminal charges against Trevor. We're also going to need to consider seeking a restraining order, she added. Your son's behavior has crossed the line from family conflict into systematic harassment and abuse. You have the right to live your life without being constantly undermined and threatened. The idea of getting a restraining order against my own son was heartbreaking, but Patricia helped me understand that Trevor's actions weren't those of a desperate child seeking help from his mother. They were the calculated moves of someone attempting to commit financial fraud using psychological manipulation. Over the next few days, Patricia connected me with Dr. Sarah Coleman, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations for elder abuse cases. Dr. Coleman's assessment was thorough and comprehensive, including cognitive testing, psychological evaluation, and a detailed review of my medical history and current functioning. Her report was unequivocal. I showed no signs of dementia, depression, or any other condition that would impair my judgment or ability to make decisions about my own life. She specifically noted that my cognitive function was at the high end of normal for my age group, and that I demonstrated excellent insight into my situation and the motivations of people around me. Mrs. Whitfield, your son's claims about your mental capacity are not just unfounded, they appear to be deliberately fabricated, Dr. Coleman told me. Your performance on every assessment we conducted indicates that you are fully capable of managing your own affairs and making informed decisions about your care and finances. The APS investigation. When Miss Martinez arrived for the scheduled home visit, I was prepared with comprehensive documentation of my competence and the evidence I'd gathered about Trevor's financial manipulation campaign. I had organized everything into a clear presentation that demonstrated both my mental acuity and the systematic nature of my son's false claims. Miss Martinez spent 3 hours in my home, reviewing my medical records, observing my living situation, and conducting her own informal assessment of my cognitive function and ability to care for myself. She was thorough, professional, and clearly experienced in distinguishing between legitimate concerns about elder welfare and manipulative attempts to control older adults. She mentioned that she had seen cases like this before.
Adult children who are facing financial crisis sometimes convince themselves that their parents' assets should be available to solve their problems. When the parents don't cooperate, the children may resort to claiming incompetence as a way to gain control. Her preliminary assessment was that the report filed against me appeared to be unfounded and potentially malicious. She would be recommending that the case be closed with no further action, and she would be documenting her findings about the apparent false nature of the original complaint. I'm also going to make a note in our system that any future reports about you should be scrutinized carefully for potential manipulation, she added. You clearly have someone in your life who is willing to abuse the system to try to control you, and we want to make sure that doesn't succeed. The breaking point approaches.
As word of the APS investigations spread through Trevor's network of lies, I began to see the first cracks in his campaign. Some of the people he had convinced of my mental decline were starting to ask questions about the discrepancy between his claims and the reality they observed when they interacted with me. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that she had spoken to other neighbors about Trevor's behavior, and several of them were expressing concern about his motives rather than my competence. My sister Carol called to apologize for initially believing Trevor's stories and to offer her support in whatever legal actions I might need to take. But Trevor himself remained silent, apparently convinced that his strategy of isolation and official pressure would eventually force me to capitulate to his demands. He had no idea that every move he made was being documented and would ultimately be used against him. The silence finally broke on a rainy Thursday evening in late June. I was reading in my living room when I heard a car door slam in my driveway, followed by heavy footsteps on my front porch. Before I could get to the door, I heard the sound of a key in the lock. Trevor was using his emergency key to let himself into my house. But this time was different. This time, I was ready for him. "Mom, we need to talk," he announced as he walked into my living room, his clothes disheveled and his eyes wild with desperation. "This has gone on long enough. I know you've been spreading lies about me to APS and to the neighbors, and it needs to stop." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw someone I barely recognized. The successful businessman who had once made me so proud had been replaced by a desperate, paranoid man who was clearly at the end of his rope. His clothes were wrinkled and ill-fitting, his hair was unkempt, and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping. "Trevor, I haven't been spreading lies about anyone," I said calmly. "I've been telling people the truth about what you've been doing." "What I've been doing?" His voice rose to a near shout. "What I've been doing is trying to help you before you completely lose your mind and end up being taken advantage of by strangers." The irony of his accusation that I was at risk of being taken advantage of by strangers while he was actively trying to steal my life savings was almost laughable. But there was nothing funny about the rage and desperation in his eyes. "Trevor, sit down," I said firmly. "We're going to have an honest conversation about what's really happening here, and you're going to listen to what I have to say." For a moment, he looked like he might refuse or storm out again, but something in my tone must have gotten through to him, because he slowly sat down on the edge of my sofa, his hands clenched into fists and his whole body radiating tension. What happened next would determine everything, not just the future of our relationship, but the ultimate fate of the inheritance he was so desperate to access. Because unbeknownst to Trevor, every word of this conversation was being recorded by the security system I'd had installed 3 weeks earlier. And everything he was about to say would be used in ways he could never have imagined. The final ultimatum. "Trevor," I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I know about the foreclosure proceedings on your house. I know about the judgments against your business.
I know about the lies you've been telling people about my mental state, and I know about your attempts to research guardianship procedures and memory care facilities." His face went white, then flushed red with anger. "You've been spying on me? You've been investigating your own son?" "I've been protecting myself from someone who was systematically trying to destroy my reputation and steal my assets. And that someone happens to be my son, which makes it even more heartbreaking." Trevor stood up abruptly, beginning to pace around my living room like a caged animal. "Mom, we need help. We're going to lose everything. The house, the business, Sophia's college fund. I need help, and you're the only family I have." "You don't need help, Trevor. You need to face the consequences of your poor decisions like an adult. And threatening your mother, lying about her mental capacity, and trying to have her declared incompetent is not asking for help, it's attempting to commit fraud." The word fraud seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression shifting from anger to something that looked almost like fear. "It's not fraud," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I genuinely believe you're not making good decisions anymore. The way you're being stubborn about obvious solutions to obvious problems, that's not normal, Mom. The only obvious problem here is that you've spent beyond your means, made bad business decisions, and now want me to liquidate my life savings to bail you out. When I refused, you decided to try to force me by claiming I was mentally incompetent." Trevor's facade of concern finally cracked completely. "Fine. Yes, I need the money. Yes, I've been telling people you're having problems because you are having problems. You're having problems seeing that your son needs help." The admission hung in the air between us, finally spoken aloud after months of manipulation and lies. Trevor had just confessed to fabricating concerns about my mental state in order to pressure me into giving him money. "And what if I continue to refuse?" I asked quietly.
His answer would haunt me for months to come. "Then you'll lose me and Melissa and Sophia forever. We'll move away and you'll never see your granddaughter again. You'll sit in this house alone with your precious money until you die, and no one will care." The threat was clear and devastating. Give him my life savings, or lose my family completely. But Trevor had made one critical error. He assumed that the threat of abandonment would break me down and make me willing to sacrifice everything to maintain our relationship. He had no idea that I'd already begun planning for a future where our relationship might not survive his betrayal. And he certainly had no idea that his final ultimatum had just been recorded for posterity, creating evidence that would change everything in ways he could never have anticipated. "Get out of my house, Trevor," I said quietly. "And don't come back unless you're ready to apologize for what you've done and seek help for whatever has made you think this behavior is acceptable." "This isn't over, Mom," he said as he headed for the door. "I'm not going to just watch you destroy yourself and our family's future out of stubbornness and pride." After he left, I sat in the silence of my living room and finally allowed myself to cry. Not just for the relationship I'd lost, but for the man my son had become. The Trevor who had just threatened to steal his daughter away from her grandmother wasn't the child I'd raised. But as painful as this realization was, it also clarified something important. I was no longer dealing with my son. I was dealing with a desperate person who was willing to use any means necessary to access my assets, including emotional blackmail and threats. And desperate people who were willing to cross ethical and legal lines needed to face consequences that would prevent them from continuing to harm others. It was time to stop being a victim and start being someone who fought back. The recording of Trevor's confession was just the beginning. The night after Trevor's explosive ultimatum, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice threatening to take Sophia away from me forever, to move his family across the country where I'd never see them again. The pain of potentially losing my granddaughter was almost unbearable. But in the cold light of dawn, I realized something crucial. Trevor's threats had revealed the true scope of his desperation and the lengths he was willing to go to access my money. I made coffee with trembling hands and sat at my kitchen table staring at the small recording device I'd retrieved from its hiding place behind my bookshelf. The entire conversation was there, captured in digital clarity. Trevor's confession that he'd been fabricating concerns about my mental state, his admission that his primary concern wasn't my well-being, but his need for money, his threat to permanently separate me from my granddaughter if I didn't comply with his financial demands. As devastating as the conversation had been to experience, I now had something invaluable. Proof. Concrete, undeniable evidence of exactly what Trevor had been doing and why. But I also knew that having evidence and knowing how to use it effectively were two very different things. I called Patricia Henley at exactly 9 a.m., knowing she'd be in her office early as she always was on Fridays. "Mrs. Whitfield, how did the conversation go?" she asked immediately upon hearing my voice. "Patricia, I need to see you today. I have a recording that changes everything." Within an hour, I was sitting in Patricia's office, watching her face grow increasingly grim as she listened to Trevor's recorded threats and admissions. When the recording finished, she sat back in her chair and shook her head. "Mrs. Whitfield, your son has just provided us with evidence of extortion, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud. This recording alone would be enough to pursue criminal charges, but I suspect it's just the tip of the iceberg." She was right. The recording was damning, but it was only part of a much larger pattern of behavior that I was now determined to fully document and understand. Patricia recommended that I hire a forensic accountant to examine Trevor's financial situation more thoroughly than my amateur internet research had revealed. She connected me with David Park, a certified fraud examiner who specialized in family financial disputes and elder abuse cases. David's investigation over the following week revealed the full scope of Trevor's financial catastrophe, and it was worse than I had imagined. Palmetto Digital Solutions wasn't just struggling, it was completely insolvent. Trevor owed over $180,000 to creditors, including $45,000 in unpaid taxes to the IRS. His business checking account had been overdrawn for 3 months straight, and he'd been juggling credit cards and personal loans to keep the lights on. But the most shocking discovery was that Trevor's financial problems went far beyond business failures. David found evidence of gambling debts, multiple payday loans, and what appeared to be a serious addiction to online sports betting. The expensive lifestyle I'd observed over the past few years hadn't been funded by business success. It had been funded by increasingly desperate borrowing and gambling.
The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Trevor wasn't just a son who had made poor business decisions. He was an addict who had been lying to everyone, including himself, about the severity of his problems. His increasingly desperate behavior toward me wasn't just about saving his business. It was about feeding an addiction that had consumed his entire life. David's investigation also revealed something even more disturbing. Trevor had been researching my financial situation for months before he'd started pressuring me directly. He'd been gathering information about my accounts, my property values, and my investment portfolios, building a comprehensive picture of my assets that he could use to calculate exactly how much money he needed to extract from me. "He's been planning this campaign against you for at least 6 months, David told me. This wasn't a desperate son asking his mother for help. This was a calculated attempt to access your assets to feed his gambling addiction." As David's investigation continued, we discovered that Trevor hadn't been acting alone in his schemes against me. Melissa, his wife, had been fully aware of their financial situation and had been actively participating in the campaign to manipulate me into providing money. David found email exchanges between Trevor and Melissa discussing strategies for pressuring me, including detailed plans for how to present their financial needs in the most sympathetic way possible. In one particularly chilling exchange, Melissa had suggested that they might need to play hardball with me if gentle persuasion didn't work. "Maybe we need to start talking about her declining mental state more publicly," Melissa had written in an email dated 3 months earlier. "If enough people become concerned about her ability to make decisions, it might create pressure for her to accept help managing her affairs." The emails revealed that Melissa had been the one to research guardianship laws in South Carolina, looking into the legal procedures for having someone declared incompetent and appointed a guardian to manage their finances. She had also been the one to contact the retirement community in Mount Pleasant, asking detailed questions about their policies regarding residents with cognitive impairment. Most heartbreakingly, the emails showed that they had been planning to use Sophia as a weapon against me from the very beginning. Eleanor would do anything to maintain contact with Sophia. If we threaten to move away or limit her access to her granddaughter, she'll cave to whatever we need, Trevor had written to Melissa. Learning that my own daughter-in-law had been actively plotting against me was almost as painful as discovering Trevor's betrayal. Melissa had sat at my dinner table, accepted my babysitting help, and smiled to my face while planning to steal my independence and my assets. With David's help, I began to understand that Trevor and Melissa's campaign against me was part of a larger pattern of financial deception that extended to other areas of their lives. They had been running similar manipulation campaigns against Melissa's parents, Trevor's former business partners, and even some of their friends. David discovered that they had borrowed substantial amounts of money from Melissa's father under false pretenses, claiming the funds were needed for business expansion when they were actually being used to cover gambling debts. They had also convinced two of Trevor's college friends to invest in his business, using fabricated financial documents to make the company appear more successful than it actually was. Your son and daughter-in-law appear to be serial financial manipulators, David explained. They've been using emotional manipulation and outright fraud to extract money from multiple sources. You're not their first victim, you're just their most recent target. The realization that Trevor's behavior toward me wasn't an isolated incident born of desperation, but part of a long-term pattern of manipulating and frauding people who cared about him, was devastating. This wasn't the son I had raised making poor decisions in a moment of crisis. This was someone who had fundamentally lost their moral compass and was willing to hurt anyone to feed his addiction. As we dug deeper into Trevor and Melissa's activities, we discovered they had been creating an extensive paper trail designed to support their claims about my mental incompetence. David found records of conversations they had had with multiple attorneys about guardianship procedures, including detailed discussions about what evidence would be needed to have someone declared incapable of managing their own affairs. They had also been systematically documenting their interactions with me, keeping detailed notes about conversations where they claimed I had seemed confused or forgetful. These notes, which were completely fabricated or grossly distorted versions of normal conversations, were being compiled as evidence to support future legal proceedings against me. Most disturbing of all, we found evidence that they had been planning to have me involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation if their other manipulation tactics failed. Melissa had researched the legal procedures for emergency mental health holds in South Carolina and had been gathering what she claimed was evidence of my declining mental state to present to medical professionals. They were building a comprehensive case to have me declared incompetent, Patricia explained as we reviewed the evidence David had uncovered. This wasn't just financial elder abuse. This was a conspiracy to strip you of your legal rights and your freedom.
The scope of their planning was breathtaking in its cruelty and thoroughness. They had been preparing multiple different approaches to access my assets, ranging from emotional manipulation to legal guardianship to involuntary psychiatric commitment. They had contingency plans for every possible scenario, including detailed strategies for what to do if I discovered their schemes and tried to fight back. David's investigation also revealed that Trevor and Melissa had been using technology to monitor and manipulate me in ways I never could have imagined. They had installed tracking software on my phone during one of their visits, allowing them to monitor my calls, texts, and internet activity. They knew about my research into their financial situation because they had been monitoring my online activity. They knew about my consultations with doctors and lawyers because they had been tracking my phone calls and calendar appointments. They had been staying one step ahead of my defensive measures because they were literally watching everything I did. Even more disturbing,
They had been using this surveillance information to refine their manipulation tactics. When they saw that I was researching their business problems, they adjusted their story to acknowledge some financial difficulties while downplaying the severity. When they saw that I was consulting with medical professionals about cognitive assessments, they began spreading more urgent claims about my mental state to create a sense of crisis that would justify immediate intervention. Your son and daughter-in-law have been conducting sophisticated surveillance and manipulation operations against you, David explained. This level of planning and execution suggests they may have been getting advice or assistance from someone with expertise in financial fraud. The revelation that they had been spying on me through my own phone was deeply violating and frightening. It meant that every step I had taken to protect myself had potentially been monitored and countered by people who had unlimited access to my personal information and communications. As we continued to investigate, we discovered that Trevor and Melissa had been maintaining detailed records of every lie they told and to whom they told it. They had spreadsheets tracking which family members and friends had been told which version of their story about my supposed mental decline, ensuring that their narratives remained consistent across different conversations. They had also been coordinating their stories with remarkable precision. When Trevor told someone that I had gotten lost driving to the grocery store, Melissa would mention the same incident to a different person a few days later, providing corroborating details that made the story seem more credible. The level of organization and premeditation revealed by these records was chilling. This wasn't desperate people making up stories on the fly. This was a carefully planned and executed campaign of character assassination designed to systematically destroy my reputation and credibility. David found evidence that they had even been planning to recruit other family members and friends as witnesses to my supposed incompetence. They had identified people in our social circle who they thought would be most likely to believe their stories and had been cultivating relationships with those people specifically to build support for their claims. As the full scope of Trevor and Melissa's conspiracy became clear, Patricia began preparing a comprehensive legal response that went far beyond simple protective measures. The evidence we had gathered suggested they had committed multiple felonies, including elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, and extortion. Your son and daughter-in-law have been conducting sophisticated surveillance and manipulation operations against you, Patricia explained. We have enough evidence to support serious criminal charges that could result in significant prison time for both of them. But Patricia also warned me that pursuing criminal charges would likely mean the complete and permanent destruction of any possibility of repairing my relationship with Trevor or maintaining contact with Sophia. Once we involved law enforcement, there would be no going back to the way things had been before. You need to understand that if we move forward with this, you may lose your granddaughter, she said gently. Trevor and Melissa will almost certainly use Sophia as leverage to try to prevent you from pressing charges. And if that doesn't work, they may follow through on their threats to move away and cut off contact. The choice was agonizing. I could protect other potential victims by ensuring that Trevor and Melissa faced consequences for their actions, but doing so would likely cost me the relationship with my granddaughter that I treasured more than anything else in the world. David's investigation revealed that Trevor and Melissa's financial manipulation had affected far more people than just me. They had defrauded Melissa's parents out of nearly $50,000, had stolen money from Trevor's business partners, and had defaulted on loans from multiple friends and family members. The total amount of money they had stolen or obtained through false pretenses was over $300,000, affecting more than a dozen different victims. Many of these people had been too embarrassed or heartbroken to report the fraud to authorities, allowing Trevor and Melissa to continue their schemes without facing consequences. David helped me contact some of these other victims, and I was shocked to learn that several of them had experienced manipulation tactics nearly identical to what I had endured. Melissa's father told me that they had claimed Melissa was suffering from depression and needed financial help for medical treatment, while actually using the money for gambling and luxury purchases. Trevor's former business partner revealed that they had been told the company was on the verge of a major breakthrough that would make everyone wealthy, while Trevor was actually using investor funds to cover his gambling debts and personal expenses. "Your son and daughter-in-law are predators," David explained. "They identify vulnerable people who care about them, exploit those emotional relationships for financial gain, and then move on to the next victim when the current one stops being profitable." With all of this evidence in hand, Patricia and I began planning what she called a legal intervention, a comprehensive response that would not only protect me from further manipulation, but would also ensure that Trevor and Melissa faced appropriate consequences for their actions. The plan involved multiple simultaneous actions: filing criminal complaints with law enforcement, seeking restraining orders to prevent further harassment, pursuing civil litigation to recover stolen funds, and implementing additional protective measures to secure my assets and personal safety. But before we moved forward with any legal action, Patricia recommended that I make one final attempt to resolve the situation without destroying my family completely. She suggested that I confront Trevor and Melissa with the evidence we had gathered, giving them an opportunity to acknowledge their actions and seek help for the problems that had led them down this path. Sometimes when people are confronted with the full scope of what they've done, they're willing to make amends and change their behavior, she explained. It's worth trying before we involve the criminal justice system, especially since your granddaughter's well-being is a factor. The idea of confronting Trevor and Melissa with evidence of their conspiracy was terrifying, but it also felt necessary. They needed to understand that their actions had consequences, and they needed to have an opportunity to choose a different path before those consequences became irreversible. Over the next week, Patricia and I prepared for what would likely be the most important conversation of my life. We organized all of the evidence David had gathered into a comprehensive presentation that would make it impossible for Trevor and Melissa to deny what they had done or continue their manipulation campaigns. We also developed a clear set of demands that would need to be met if they wanted to avoid criminal prosecution: immediate cessation of all harassment and manipulation, public acknowledgement of their lives to everyone they had deceived, repayment of all money obtained through false pretenses, and genuine participation in addiction treatment and family counseling. Mrs. Whitfield, you need to be prepared for the possibility that they will reject this offer and continue trying to manipulate you. People who have gone as far as your son and daughter-in-law have often can't acknowledge what they've done, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. But I had to try. Despite everything they had done to me, Trevor was still my son, and Sophia was still my granddaughter. If there was any chance of saving our family relationships while still protecting myself and other potential victims, I had to take it. The confrontation would take place in Patricia's office, with witnesses present and recording equipment running. Everything would be documented, both for legal protection and to ensure that Trevor and Melissa couldn't later claim that our conversation had been different from what actually occurred. As I prepared for this meeting, I reflected on how much I had changed since that first conversation with Trevor about his business problems 6 months ago. I had gone from being a trusting mother who wanted to help her struggling son to being someone who had uncovered a massive conspiracy against me and was preparing to potentially send my own child to prison. The transformation was painful but necessary. I had learned that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all. It was enablement that allowed harmful behavior to continue and escalate. Real love sometimes required setting consequences that were painful but necessary for everyone involved. Trevor and Melissa were about to learn that their victim was no longer the vulnerable, isolated woman they had been trying to manipulate. They were about to face someone who had fought back with intelligence, determination, and the full force of the legal system. And they were about to discover that some gambles carry consequences that last far longer than the problems that prompted them. The confrontation that would determine the fate of our family was just days away. The week before the planned confrontation with Trevor and Melissa passed with an eerie calm that reminded me of the stillness before a hurricane. I spent my days reviewing evidence, rehearsing what I would say, and steeling myself for what might be the most difficult conversation of my life. Patricia had arranged for the meeting to take place in her conference room on a Tuesday afternoon, with David Park present as a witness and a court reporter documenting everything for the official record. Despite all the preparation, I found myself lying awake each night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was making the right choice. The grandmother in me kept hoping that once Trevor and Melissa saw the full scope of the evidence against them, they would break down, apologize, and agree to get the help they desperately needed. The realist in me, informed by months of their increasingly cruel behavior, knew that people who had gone as far as they had rarely chose accountability over continued manipulation. Patricia had warned me repeatedly about managing my expectations. "Mrs. Whitfield, I've been handling cases like this for over 20 years. She had said during our final preparation meeting. People who engage in this level of systematic abuse rarely respond to confrontation with genuine remorse. More often, they escalate their tactics or attempt to turn themselves into victims. But I had to try. If there was even a small chance that shocking them with the truth might break through whatever combination of addiction, desperation, and entitlement had turned my son into someone I barely recognized, I owed it to Sophia and to the memory of the boy Trevor used to be to take that chance. The invitation. On Monday morning, I made the phone call I had been dreading. Trevor answered on the third ring, his voice immediately suspicious when he heard mine. "Mom, this is unexpected. I thought you needed time to think about what we discussed." The casual way he referred to his explosive threats and ultimatum as something we discussed made my jaw clench, but I kept my voice steady and neutral. "Trevor, I do need to talk with you and Melissa. There are some things that have come to light that we need to address as a family." "What kind of things?" His voice sharpened with what sounded like genuine concern, though I suspected he was worried about what I might have discovered rather than genuinely caring about my well-being. "It would be better to discuss this in person. Can you and Melissa meet me tomorrow afternoon at Patricia Henley's office, say 2 p.m.? There was a long pause. "Your lawyer's office? Mom, that sounds pretty formal for a family discussion." "It is formal, Trevor. Given everything that has happened between us, I think it's best to have witnesses present and everything properly documented." A long pause again, longer this time. I could almost hear him calculating, trying to figure out what I knew and how dangerous this meeting might be for him. "Can you at least give me a hint about what this is concerning?" I took a deep breath, knowing that my next words would determine whether he showed up at all. "It's about the lies you've been telling about my mental health, the money you've stolen from other family members, and the surveillance software you installed on my phone." The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if he had hung up. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was completely different, harder, more calculating. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're making some serious accusations." "I'm not making accusations, Trevor. I'm stating facts that I can prove. The question is whether you want to address these issues privately as a family, or whether you'd prefer to have this conversation in a courtroom." The implicit threat hung between us. Trevor was smart enough to understand that I was offering him one final chance to resolve things without involving law enforcement. "We'll be there," he said finally, and the line went dead.
the final preparations. That evening, Patricia and I conducted one last review of our strategy. The goal was to present the evidence in a way that would make denial impossible, while still leaving room for Trevor and Melissa to take responsibility and make amends. We would start with the financial fraud evidence, move through the surveillance and manipulation campaigns, and end with the recording of Trevor's threats and admissions. Remember, Patricia advised, your job is not to prosecute them or punish them. That's what the courts are for if they choose not to cooperate. Your job is to clearly present the facts and give them an opportunity to respond appropriately. David Park had prepared visual aids, charts showing the timeline of their manipulation campaign, bank records documenting the stolen money, and screenshots of the emails between Trevor and Melissa planning their schemes against me. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, presented in a format that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. We had also prepared a written agreement that Trevor and Melissa could sign if they chose to take responsibility for their actions. The agreement required them to make full restitution to all victims, cease all harassment and manipulation, publicly acknowledge their lies to everyone they had deceived, and participate in addiction counseling and family therapy. In return, I would agree not to pursue criminal charges, though the agreement made clear that any future violations would result in immediate prosecution.
This is their one chance, Patricia emphasized. If they reject this offer or try to manipulate their way out of consequences, we proceed with criminal charges. There won't be any second chances or further negotiations. The confrontation began. Tuesday afternoon arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that Charleston summers were famous for. I arrived at Patricia's office 30 minutes early, partly because I wanted to be settled and calm before Trevor and Melissa arrived, but mostly because I couldn't sit still at home any longer. Patricia's conference room was formal and intimidating, with its polished oak table, leather chairs, and walls lined with law books. David had arranged his evidence materials at one end of the table, while the court reporter had set up her equipment at the other. Everything was designed to convey the seriousness of the situation and make it clear that this was not a casual family chat. At exactly 2 p.m., Trevor and Melissa arrived. I could see immediately that they had spent considerable time preparing for this meeting. They were both dressed professionally, Trevor in a suit that I suspected he could no longer afford, Melissa in a conservative dress that projected respectability and maternal concern. But their clothing couldn't hide the strain in their faces or the tension in their body language. "Hello, Mom," Trevor said as they entered the conference room. His voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes were already scanning the evidence materials David had arranged on the table. "Eleanor," Melissa added, her tone artificially warm, "I hope you're feeling well." The fake concern in her voice, given everything I now knew about her involvement in the conspiracy against me, was almost insulting. But I simply nodded and gestured for them to take seats across from Patricia and me. "Thank you both for coming," Patricia began once everyone was settled. "Mrs. Whitfield has asked me to facilitate this meeting because some serious issues have come to light that need to be addressed. Before we begin, I want to make it clear that everything said here today is being recorded and transcribed for the official record." Trevor and Melissa exchanged a quick glance. "Are we going to need our own attorney?" Trevor asked. "That's your choice, but I'd recommend listening to what we have to say before making that decision." The evidence unveiled. What followed was the most methodical dismantling of deception I had ever witnessed. David Park began with a comprehensive presentation of Trevor's financial situation, using bank records, court documents, and business filings to paint a complete picture of his business failures and gambling addiction. "Mr. Whitfield, our investigation shows that over the past 18 months, you have lost approximately $240,000 to online sports betting," David announced, pulling up records on his laptop that projected onto a screen at the front of the room. "During the same period, you have obtained money through false pretenses from at least 12 different individuals, including your mother-in-law, your business partners, and several family friends." Trevor's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. "I don't know where you're getting these numbers, but..." These are official bank records and court filings, David interrupted smoothly. Everything I'm showing you is documented fact. The evidence was devastating and methodical. David showed them records of every loan, every lie, every manipulation they had employed to extract money from trusting friends and family members. He detailed Trevor's gambling losses with mathematical precision, showing how each financial crisis had led to increasingly desperate attempts to recoup losses with bigger bets and riskier schemes. Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her chair as David revealed her role in researching guardianship laws and psychiatric commitment procedures. Her face flushed red when he read aloud from her emails discussing strategies for pressuring me and using Sophia as leverage. Mrs. Whitfield, David continued, turning his attention to Melissa, you wrote in an email dated March 15th, and I quote, "If we can't convince her to help willingly, we may need to have her declared incompetent. I've researched the process, and with enough documentation of confused behavior, we could get guardianship within 6 months." The room fell silent except for the quiet clicking of the court reporter's machine. Melissa's artificial composure finally cracked, and she looked genuinely shocked that their private communications had been discovered and documented. The surveillance software revelation. But the evidence that seemed to hit them hardest was the revelation about the surveillance software on my phone. David pulled up detailed logs showing every call I made, every text I sent, and every website I had visited over the past 4 months. You installed tracking software on your mother's phone during a visit in February, David announced, looking directly at Trevor. This software gave you access to all of her communications, her location data, and her internet activity. You used this information to stay ahead of her efforts to protect herself and to refine your manipulation tactics. Trevor's carefully maintained facade finally began to crack, and he stammered, That's not illegal. Parents track their kids' phones all the time." "You're not her parent. You're an adult child who installed surveillance software on your elderly mother's phone without her knowledge or consent in order to facilitate financial abuse. In South Carolina, that's a felony." The legal weight of what they had done seemed to hit them both simultaneously. This wasn't just a family dispute or even simple financial manipulation. They had committed multiple serious crimes that carried significant prison sentences.
But the piece of evidence that shattered any remaining pretense was the recording of Trevor's ultimatum from the previous week. When Patricia played the audio of Trevor admitting that he had been fabricating concerns about my mental health and threatening to permanently separate me from Sophia, the room fell into shocked silence. Trevor's own voice filled the conference room. "Yes, I need the money. Yes, I've been telling people you're having problems because you are having problems. You're having problems seeing that your son needs help." When the recording reached the part where he threatened that I would die alone, Melissa actually gasped and looked at her husband with something that might have been horror. "Trevor," she whispered, "you never told me you said that to her." The recording continued, capturing every cruel word, every admission of manipulation, every threat he had made. By the time it finished, Trevor was staring at the table, his hands clenched into fists, while Melissa sat back in her chair, looking like she was seeing her husband clearly for the first time. That recording, combined with all the other evidence we've presented today, constitutes clear proof of elder abuse, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud, Patricia announced. These are serious felonies that carry substantial prison sentences. The moment of truth. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Trevor and Melissa sat across from us, the weight of their exposed crimes settling over them like a suffocating blanket. I watched my son's face cycle through a series of expressions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally something that might have been despair. "What do you want?" Trevor asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Patricia slid a copy of the agreement we had prepared across the table. "Mrs. Whitfield is prepared to give you one opportunity to make things right without involving law enforcement. The terms are outlined in this agreement."
Trevor picked up the document with shaking hands and began to read. His face grew paler with each paragraph. The agreement was comprehensive and demanding: full restitution to all victims, public acknowledgement of the lies they had spread, immediate cessation of all harassment and manipulation, participation in addiction counseling and family therapy, and agreement to supervise visitation with Sophia that could be revoked if there were any violations. This is everything, Trevor said, looking up from the document. You want us to admit to everyone that we've been lying, pay back money we don't have, and basically put our lives under your control? I want you to take responsibility for the harm you've caused and get the help you clearly need, I said, speaking directly to my son for the first time since the meeting began. Trevor, you have a gambling addiction that has destroyed your business, your finances, and your relationships. You need professional help, not more money to feed your addiction. The word addiction seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He looked around the room as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. And if we refuse? Melissa asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Then we file criminal charges tomorrow morning, Patricia replied matter-of-factly. Elder abuse, fraud, extortion, identity theft, conspiracy, the charges will likely result in significant prison time for both of you. Your daughter will be placed with social services while you serve your sentences. The mention of Sophia seemed to break through whatever defenses Melissa had left. She began crying, real tears this time, rather than the manipulative displays I had witnessed so many times before. How did we get here? She sobbed, looking at Trevor with a mixture of love and revulsion. How did we become these people? What happened next was both heartbreaking and revelatory. Trevor, faced with undeniable evidence of his crimes and the collapse of all his manipulation tactics, finally began to tell the truth about his gambling addiction and the spiral of lies and theft it had created. It started small, he said, his voice hollow and defeated. Just some weekend games, betting on college football with friends. But then I started using apps, betting bigger amounts, chasing losses. Every time I lost, I told myself I just needed one big win to get even. He described how the gambling had quickly consumed his life, how he had hidden losses from Melissa while borrowing money from increasingly dangerous sources. The business failures weren't just due to poor management. He had been stealing money from client accounts to fund his betting, creating a cascade of problems that had destroyed his professional reputation. He kept thinking I could win it all back before anyone noticed, and when that didn't work, I started looking at Mom's money and thinking, she's old, she doesn't need all that money, she's going to leave it to me anyway. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. This was my son acknowledging that he had viewed me not as his mother, but as an obstacle between him and money he felt entitled to. Melissa's testimony was equally damaging and revealing. She admitted that she had known about Trevor's gambling from early on, but had been too ashamed and frightened to confront it directly. Instead, she had become his accomplice, helping him devise schemes to obtain money, while telling herself that they were just borrowing from family members who could afford it. She researched the guardianship laws because Trevor said if we could just get control of Eleanor's finances temporarily, we could pay everyone back and get our lives together. She never thought about what it would do to her, what it would mean to take away her independence. I was just focused on keeping our family together.
3 days after Trevor and Melissa signed the agreement, I received the first indication of whether they were truly committed to change. Mrs. Patterson called me that morning, her voice filled with confusion and concern. "Eleanor, I just had the strangest conversation with your son," she said. "He came to my door this morning and apologized for spreading lies about your mental health. He said he had been desperate for money and had made up stories about you being confused or forgetful." My heart lifted slightly. This was exactly what the agreement required: public acknowledgement of the lies to everyone they had deceived. But Mrs. Patterson's next words brought me back to reality. "But Eleanor, he also said something about how this was all a misunderstanding and that you two had worked things out as a family. He made it sound like the lies weren't really that serious, just a son worried about his mother who maybe exaggerated his concerns. Even in his apology, Trevor was trying to minimize and manipulate. He was technically complying with the agreement by acknowledging the lies, but he was framing them as innocent misunderstandings rather than calculated attempts to destroy my reputation and steal my independence. Over the next week, similar calls came from neighbors, family members, and friends. Trevor was making his required apologies, but each one was carefully crafted to make him appear sympathetic rather than predatory. He was portraying himself as a desperate son who had made poor choices while trying to help his mother, rather than as someone who had systematically planned to defraud me of my assets and freedom. Patricia wasn't surprised when I reported this pattern to her. "He's complying with the letter of the agreement while violating its spirit," she observed. "It's exactly what I expected from someone with his psychological profile." The restitution struggle. The 30-day deadline for presenting a restitution plan revealed even more about Trevor and Melissa's true commitment to making amends. The plan they submitted was laughably inadequate, a proposal to pay back the money they had stolen at a rate of $200 per month, which would take over 60 years to complete. "They're hoping you'll die before they have to pay everything back," David Park explained bluntly as we reviewed their proposal. "This isn't a serious attempt at restitution, it's a delaying tactic." More troubling were the financial records Trevor submitted as part of his restitution plan. Despite claiming poverty and inability to pay back his victims, David discovered that Trevor had recently purchased lottery tickets worth over $500 and had made several sports bets totaling nearly $1,000. His gambling addiction was still active, even as he was supposedly working to make amends for the damage it had caused. When I confronted Patricia about these violations, she recommended immediate enforcement action. "Mrs. Whitfield, they're not taking this agreement seriously. They're using it as a shield to avoid prosecution while continuing the same behaviors that created this situation." But I found myself hesitating. Despite everything Trevor had done, he was still my son. And more importantly, enforcing the agreement would likely mean losing all contact with Sophia. The thought of never seeing my granddaughter again was almost unbearable. The manipulation continues. My hesitation to immediately enforce consequences for Trevor's violations gave him the opening he needed to launch a new manipulation campaign. This time, he was using Sophia directly as a weapon against me. He began bringing her to my house for brief, supervised visits, but each visit came with subtle threats and manipulations. "Sophia really loves these visits with Grandma," he would say meaningfully. "It would be such a shame if anything disrupted our family getting back together." During one particularly painful visit, Trevor had clearly coached Sophia to ask me questions that were designed to manipulate my emotions. "Grandma, why were you mad at Daddy?" she asked with the innocent directness of a 4-year-old. "Daddy said you might not want to see me anymore if you stay mad at him." The cruelty of using a child to manipulate her grandmother was breathtaking, but it was also strategically effective. Every time I considered enforcing the agreement and pursuing criminal charges, I thought about Sophia's confused little face asking why Grandma didn't want to see her anymore. Melissa had become even more sophisticated in her manipulations. She would call me crying, talking about how much Trevor was struggling with his addiction and how hard he was trying to change. "Eleanor, I know he made terrible mistakes, but he's getting help now. If you send him to prison, it won't just destroy him, it will destroy Sophia's future too." The final straw came 2 months after the agreement was signed. I discovered that Trevor had been telling people at Sophia's preschool that I was going through some health challenges and that he was helping coordinate my care. The teachers and other parents had been treating me with the kind of pitying concern reserved for people with serious medical problems. Even worse, Trevor had used this narrative to explain why I wouldn't be able to continue my regular volunteer activities with the children's charity at the hospital. He had effectively forced me into a kind of social retirement based on fake health concerns, limiting my independence and social connections just as he had originally planned. When I confronted him about these violations, his response revealed that nothing had really changed. "Mom, I never said you were sick,"
he said, with the same gaslighting tone he had used throughout his manipulation campaign. "I just mentioned that you were dealing with some family stress and health concerns. People misunderstand things."
The familiar pattern of lies, minimization, and gaslighting made it clear that the agreement had accomplished nothing except giving Trevor a temporary shield from prosecution while he continued his manipulative behaviors. That night, I called Patricia. "I want to pursue criminal charges," I said. "The agreement was a mistake. He's not capable of change, and I won't continue to enable his behavior by protecting him from consequences." Within a week, Patricia had filed comprehensive criminal charges against both Trevor and Melissa: elder abuse, fraud, extortion, identity theft, conspiracy. The charges were serious and carried substantial prison sentences. The evidence we had compiled over months of investigation made the case virtually unwinnable for the defense. Trevor's response to the criminal charges revealed the true extent of his narcissism and entitlement. Rather than taking responsibility for violating the agreement, he launched a vicious public campaign against me, claiming that I was a bitter old woman who was destroying her own family out of spite. He told anyone who would listen that I had lost my mind and was being manipulated by greedy lawyers who were trying to steal his inheritance. He painted himself as the victim of an elderly mother's paranoid delusions and vindictive legal advisors. But this time his lies fell on deaf ears. Too many people had seen the pattern of his behavior, and too many community members had been contacted during his required apologies for anyone to believe his new version of events. The trial, when it finally came 6 months later, was swift and decisive. The evidence was overwhelming, and Trevor and Melissa's defense attorneys quickly recommended plea bargains rather than risk the much harsher sentences that would come from jury convictions. Trevor received 18 months in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Melissa received 12 months in prison and 3 years of probation. Both were ordered to pay full restitution to all victims and to have no unsupervised contact with elderly family members upon release. As I had feared, the criminal prosecution triggered a bitter custody battle over Sophia. With both parents facing prison time, Melissa's parents stepped forward to seek custody, and they made it clear that they blamed me for destroying their daughter's family. The custody hearings were among the most painful experiences of my life. Melissa's parents portrayed me as a vindictive woman who had chosen revenge over family unity, arguing that Sophia would be better off with grandparents who prioritized family loyalty over legal technicalities. But Patricia and David had prepared thoroughly for this possibility. They presented evidence showing that Melissa's parents had also been victims of Trevor and Melissa's financial fraud, and that they had demonstrated poor judgment in enabling the couple's destructive behaviors by providing money without asking questions. More importantly, they showed that I had tried repeatedly to resolve the situation without involving law enforcement, and that I had only pursued criminal charges after Trevor and Melissa had violated their agreement and continued their manipulation campaigns. The judge, the Honorable Margaret Chen, was thorough in her review of all the evidence. In her final ruling, she noted that while the situation was tragic for everyone involved, the priority had to be Sophia's safety and well-being. This court finds that Mrs. Whitfield acted responsibly in protecting herself and other potential victims from systematic financial abuse, Judge Chen stated. Her decision to pursue criminal charges only after repeated violations of a generous settlement agreement demonstrates reasonable attempts to preserve family relationships while ensuring appropriate consequences for criminal behavior. Judge Chen awarded me joint custody of Sophia, along with Melissa's parents, with specific provisions for regular visitation and participation in decisions about her education and welfare. The ruling ensured that I would remain a consistent presence in my granddaughter's life, while also providing her with stable housing and care during her parents' incarceration. Today, 18 months after that first conversation about Trevor's business problems, my life looks completely different from what I expected. Trevor is serving his sentence in a minimum security facility, where he is finally receiving treatment for his gambling addiction. Our relationship is limited to occasional supervised phone calls that are monitored by prison officials.
Melissa was released after serving 10 months, and she has genuinely been working to rebuild her life. She has enrolled in financial counseling, is attending addiction support meetings for family members, and has expressed what appears to be genuine remorse for her role in the conspiracy against me. Our relationship is cautious, but improving, particularly around our shared love for Sophia. Sophia splits her time between my house and her maternal grandparents, and while the custody arrangement is complicated, it has allowed her to maintain relationships with both sides of her family. She's too young to fully understand what happened between her parents and me, but she knows that sometimes adults make mistakes that have consequences. I've returned to my volunteer work at the hospital, where my colleagues now know the truth about Trevor's lies. I've also become an advocate for other seniors facing financial abuse, speaking at community centers about the warning signs of manipulation and the importance of seeking help when family relationships become exploitative.
My assets are now protected by legal safeguards that make it impossible for anyone to gain unauthorized access, even if something does happen to my mental or physical health in the future. I've updated my will to reflect the new realities of my family situation, with provisions that will support Sophia's future, while ensuring that any inheritance she receives will be protected from potential manipulation by others. People often ask me if I regret pursuing criminal charges against my own son. The answer is complicated. I regret that Trevor made choices that forced me to choose between enabling his destructive behavior and protecting myself and other potential victims. I regret that Sophia has had to grow up with the knowledge that both her parents went to prison. I regret that our family was destroyed by addiction, greed, and entitlement. But I don't regret refusing to be a victim. I don't regret standing up for myself when my own child tried to steal my independence and dignity. And I don't regret ensuring that Trevor faced consequences that might finally force him to confront his addiction and change his behavior. The woman who was told she would die alone is anything but alone. I have Sophia, who brings joy and laughter to my life twice a week. I have new friendships forged through my advocacy work. I have the respect of my community and the satisfaction of knowing that I fought back against injustice, even when it was difficult and painful. Trevor was wrong about many things, but he was most wrong about this. I didn't die alone because I chose money over family. I chose self-respect over manipulation, consequences over enabling, and truth over comfortable lies. And in making those choices, I discovered that real strength isn't about how much abuse you can endure. It's about knowing when to stop enduring and start fighting back. The judge didn't just have other plans for my estate. She had other plans for my life. Plans that included dignity, justice, and the kind of relationships built on respect rather than exploitation. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought with the people we love most, but sometimes those battles are necessary to save not just ourselves, but the possibility of genuine love in the future. I'm curious about your thoughts on this story. Have you ever faced manipulation from family members? What would you have done in my situation? Share your experiences in the comments below, and let me know what country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if this story touched you, I have 2 other incredible stories of people who fought back against impossible odds. You'll find them linked at the end of this video. Thanks for staying with me through this entire journey. Remember, you're never too old to stand up for yourself, and love without boundaries isn't really love at all.